itself. It was the winter of 1348, a year folks in the village would talk about for decades, not just because of the cold itself, but because of how it came, quietly and quickly, like a fox sneaking into the henhouse. No warning, no mercy. The fields itself, which were full of barley and wheat just weeks ago, now sat under a thick white blanket. Snow stretched out as far as the eye could see itself, smooth and untouched, like some giant had spilled flour all over the land. Even the old river, usually rushing and gurgling itself, was frozen stiff. Not a crack, not a ripple, just ice, still as stone. And the wind, oh, the wind was something else itself. It didn't blow like in the stories, no howling wolves or eerie whistles. No, this wind was quiet, dead quiet itself. The kind that sneaks up on you, wraps around your neck, and whispers itself. Hope you wore your thick socks. In a little village nestled between hills and woods, just a handful of houses made of timber and stone, our story begins itself. Smoke rose lazily from chimneys as the villagers huddled close to their fires itself. Most had already stocked up for the winter, firewood stacked high, root cellars full itself, and sheep wearing what looked like their fluffiest winter coats. But not everyone was cozy and warm. Out near the edge of the village itself, in a crooked little cottage with a slanted roof and a door that never closed quite right, lived a boy named Tom, 14 years old itself, scrawny as a broomstick, and not particularly brave, but he had kind eyes, quick feet, and a knack for noticing things others missed itself. He was the son of a weaver, but that wasn't exactly his dream job. Tom would have much preferred being a knight, or maybe a baker itself. Anything that didn't involve sitting for hours untangling thread while your back screamed in pain. But today wasn't about weaving itself. It started like any other cold day. Tom was up early, bundled in 3 layers of wool itself, poking the fire with a stick and waiting for it to wake up properly itself. His mum was in the corner muttering something about frozen water jugs itself, and his dad was already outside trying to chop wood with an axe so dull it might as well have been a spoon itself. Tom had one job that morning: check on the chickens and make sure the goat hadn't escaped again. Easy enough, or so he thought itself. Stepping outside, he was smacked in the face by a blast of cold so sharp it felt like tiny needles poking every inch of skin itself. He pulled his hood tighter and trudged through the snow, his boots crunching with every step. The chickens were fine itself, huddled together in their coop like a fluffy ball of feathers. The goat, whose name was Martha, don't ask, gave him a suspicious look itself, as if daring him to try and tie her up again. By the time he finished feeding them, his nose had gone completely numb itself. Not just cold, gone, vanished. He poked it to check if it was still there. It was barely itself. He was about to head back inside when he noticed something strange. The sky had shifted. What was once a pale grey had turned darker itself, heavier, like it was holding something back. Snow, maybe, or trouble. He paused. The trees at the edge of the forest were coated in ice itself, their branches creaking softly. The silence was thick, too thick. Even the birds had gone quiet, and that's when he felt it itself. A sudden drop in temperature, not the kind you ignore, the kind that makes you turn around fast and say, "Nope, self, not today." But as Tom made his way back to the cottage, the wind picked up. It wasn't loud, but it was biting itself, sharp enough to make your eyes water. His cloak flapped like a flag in battle, and snow started to fall again. Not the fluffy itself, pretty kind. These flakes were heavy, wet, mean. By the time he reached the door, the sky had gone full grey. Thick clouds rolled in itself, covering the hills, pressing down on the village like a woolen cap. Inside, the fire was still going, but just barely itself. His mum handed him a bowl of thin onion soup and said, "Eat quick. Might not be hot for long." A classic winter cooking itself. A whole onion sacrificed to the pot. Maybe a bit of stale bread if they were lucky. Tom sat by the fire, soup in hand itself, staring out the small window. It was barely noon, and already the day was turning dark. The storm had settled in itself. It wasn't going anywhere. The villagers, he knew, would start locking doors, boarding windows, checking chimneys itself. And anyone caught outside after dark. Well, let's just say nobody wanted to be that guy. Tom shivered, not from the cold itself, but from a strange feeling in his gut, like something was coming itself. The kind of night where even the bravest stayed in bed and prayed their roof didn't cave in. Later that evening itself, the wind howled for real. Not a whisper anymore, a scream. The snow was flying sideways, hammering against the walls itself. Tom's dad nailed a cloth over the cracks in the door to keep the draft out. The fire popped and hissed, struggling to stay alive itself. Tom lay in bed, wrapped in every blanket they owned, staring at the ceiling itself. He listened to the storm and wondered what it was like out there, out in the woods, past the village itself, where no fire burned and no roof stood overhead. He told himself he'd never be out in that. No way, not him. But fate, as we know itself, has a strange sense of humor, and sometimes the cold finds you, whether you're ready or not itself. Winter in the Middle Ages wasn't just about putting on an extra woolen cloak or having a cup of hot cider. No, itself. It was a whole different world. The kind of world where cold wasn't just uncomfortable, it was dangerous, like itself. If you don't find warmth soon, you might turn into a popsicle. Dangerous. Imagine this: no central heating, no electric blankets itself, no microwaves to warm up last night's stew, just a big fire in the middle of the room itself, and maybe a thick curtain or two to keep the cold out. That was it. For people like Tom and his family, winter meant one thing itself: huddle close to the hearth and pray your firewood lasts. Back then, homes weren't made for comfort itself. The walls were thick with stone or wood, sure, but they didn't stop the cold from sneaking in through cracks, holes itself, and even the roof, windows, tiny holes covered with oiled parchment or cloth if you were lucky. Otherwise, itself, just open gaps letting in the frost and curious birds. And insulation. Ha! That was just thick wool blankets or hanging tapestries itself, which helped a little but didn't exactly turn the house into a cozy cave. Most heat came from one place: the hearth itself. The hearth was basically the heart of the home, a big stone or brick fireplace that could hold a roaring fire itself. It was where people cooked, gathered, and tried to keep warm, but it wasn't perfect itself. Firewood had to be chopped and dried well before winter, or else it would burn slow and smoky itself. And there was always the risk that the fire would die out overnight, leaving everyone to shiver in the dark. In Tom's village itself, the woodcutter's work never really stopped, even in the deepest freeze. His father and the other men took turns chopping wood itself, hauling it back and stacking it carefully to keep it dry. Still, no matter how hard they worked itself, the fire was a fragile thing, like a tiny son you had to guard with your life. Now, imagine you're not inside itself, but outside in the freezing night. That's a whole different story. Out there, the cold isn't just a chill down your spine itself. It's a beast that sneaks into your bones. It steals your strength, slows your thoughts, and if you don't act fast, it can be deadly itself. Medieval folks knew about this beast well. They called it many names, but today we'd call it hypothermia itself. Hypothermia happens when your body loses heat faster than it can make it. Your fingers go numb, your lips turn blue itself. Your mind gets foggy. It's like your body slowly turning into a block of ice, except without the fun of a popsicle itself. Then there's frostbite, when the skin and even the flesh freeze. It usually hit fingers, toes, noses, and ears first itself. Folks who lost a limb to frostbite didn't have hospitals or surgeons to fix it, just a sharp knife and a prayer itself. And if you were really unlucky, starvation. Because winter meant the fields were bare, animals were scarce itself, and the village stores could run low. The root cellars might hold some turnips or dried beans, but fresh food, forget about it. For Tom, self, the stakes were getting higher. The cold night was not just a bother, it was a threat. And now, self, as the storm rolled in thicker and faster, Tom found himself caught in a situation many feared, stuck outside, self. Far from the safety of the warm hearth. It had happened quick. Tom had gone out to check on the animals before the storm hit full force, self. But the snow came down so fast, and the wind blew so hard, he lost his way on the path back home. The familiar woods looked strange and shadowy, like a dark maze. His feet sank deep into the snow, self, and every breath he took came out as a puff of white. The cold gnawed at his skin like a hungry mouse nibbling on bread, self. He tried to stay calm. That's what his father always said, keep calm, and the cold won't win. But it was getting harder itself. Tom pulled his cloak tighter, but it wasn't enough. His fingers, stiff and trembling, could barely hold the little knife he carried itself. He wished for a fire, for a roof, for anything but this frozen wilderness. In the Middle Ages, self, being caught out like this was serious business. Travelers who didn't plan ahead could end up frozen solid or lost forever, self. Some villages had watchmen or travelers who carried flint and steel, ready to make fire anywhere. But Tom had neither, itself. He thought about the animals in the forest, foxes and wolves, who had thick fur and knew how to survive the cold, self. But Tom was just a boy in woolen clothes, no match for the wild winter, as the wind whipped around him, self. Tom remembered a story his grandmother once told him. It was about a poor shepherd who got lost in a blizzard, self. The shepherd found a hollow tree and curled up inside, using his own cloak as a blanket. By morning, self, he'd survived, not because he was strong, but because he stayed calm and found shelter. Tom hoped he could do the same. With slow, self, careful steps, he looked around for anything that could protect him from the wind. A fallen tree, a rocky outcrop, self, even a pile of snow to dig into. The cold night was coming, and the harsh truth was clear: without shelter and fire, self, the cold would take him. But Tom was determined. He remembered what his father always said about woodcutters, itself. Even the strongest fire starts with a single spark. With that thought, Tom squared his shoulders, wiped the snow from his face, self, and started moving toward a dark shape in the distance. Maybe it was a building. Maybe it was just a big tree. Either way, self, it was better than nothing. Because in a world without heat, the cold wasn't just something to endure. It was a challenge to outsmart self. As the day slowly slipped away, the world around Tom began to change. The pale grey sky shifted, self, melting into colours that were soft and strange. The snow, once bright and white, started to take on a rosy glow, self, like it was blushing at the coming night. Long shadows stretched across the frozen fields, self, reaching out like sleepy fingers trying to catch the last bit of daylight. Trees, bare and skeletal, stood still, self, their branches tracing delicate patterns against the pink sky. The air was quiet, self, not the kind of quiet that fills a room when everyone is reading or knitting. No, this was the quiet that holds its breath, self, the kind of silence where even the smallest sounds, like a twig snapping or snow crunching underfoot, seem huge and startling, self. Tom felt the quiet all around him. The only sounds came from the wind, whispering softly through the trees, and, somewhere far away, itself, the lonely howl of a wolf. The howl was haunting, but strangely beautiful, like a song from a far-off place. It made Tom shiver, self, but not just from the cold. It was a reminder the wild was watching, waiting. As the light faded, itself, Tom realized the cold was getting worse, sneaking under his cloak, biting at his fingers and toes, self. The rosy snow was turning to blue shadows, and the night was closing in fast, self. His breath came out in small clouds that disappeared quickly in the cold air. Every step he took felt heavier, self. The path that had seemed clear in the morning was now covered in snow and darkness. Tom knew he had to find shelter soon, self. The thought settled in his chest like a heavy stone. No more wandering, no more hoping the storm would pass. Night was coming, self, and with it, the true challenge of the freezing cold. He looked around, scanning the darkening landscape. There, through the trees, self, he spotted a faint outline, a shape that could be a building or maybe a big rock. It was hard to tell in the fading light, self. With every step toward it, the silence seemed deeper. The world felt smaller, like the night was pulling a soft blanket over everything, self. Tom's heart beat faster, not from fear, but from knowing that soon he'd have to face the cold without the sun's help, self. But he wasn't ready to give up. The snow crunched beneath his boots as he walked, the sound sharp in the quiet evening itself. The cold nipped at his cheeks, turning them red and raw. He tried to remember what his father had taught him about winter nights, itself. The darkest part is just before the dawn. Keep moving, itself, and you'll find your way. Tom took a deep breath and pulled his cloak tighter around him. His fingers were stiff now, itself, but he kept them wrapped inside his sleeves, trying to keep warm. Suddenly, a soft rustle came from the bushes nearby. Tom froze, itself. His eyes scanned the shadows, searching for the source. It was only a small rabbit, darting quickly through the snow itself, disappearing as fast as it had come. Tom let out a quiet laugh. Even the rabbits are in a hurry tonight, he whispered to himself, itself. He stepped forward, feeling a strange mix of loneliness and determination. The pinkish light was fading fast, itself, turning the world into soft greys and blues. As the last rays of sun disappeared behind the hills, itself, the sky deepened into a rich velvet black. The stars began to twinkle faintly, distant fires in the sky. The wind picked up again, wrapping around Tom like a cold hand. He shivered but kept moving. Looking back, itself, he saw the village's faint lights, tiny dots glowing behind the snow-covered roofs, safe and warm, but far away, itself. The thought made his stomach ache. He missed his family, his warm bed, the smell of his mother's cooking, itself. But now was not the time to feel sorry for himself. He had to find shelter, itself. His eyes caught sight of a flicker, a shadow against the snow, something dark and solid. Tom quickened his pace, itself, hope rising in his chest. As he drew closer, he realized it was an old barn. Its wooden walls were weathered and cracked, itself, but it stood tall against the cold wind. The barn looked like it hadn't been used in a while, doors hanging slightly open, itself, a roof missing a few shingles. But it was shelter, and right now shelter was everything, itself. Tom pushed the creaky door open and stepped inside. The air smelled of hay and dust. It was colder than the village cottage itself, but at least the walls blocked the worst of the wind. He found a corner piled with dry straw and settled down, pulling his cloak tighter, itself. Outside, the wind continued its song, but inside there was a quiet peace. Tom closed his eyes, itself, letting the sound of the storm wash over him. He thought about the stars, the wolves, the rabbits, itself, and the fading light that had brought him here. And as the night grew deeper, he promised himself one thing, itself. He would survive this freezing night, no matter what. Because sometimes the darkest nights bring out the strongest hearts, itself. The barn was cold, but it gave Tom a little time to think. He knew he couldn't stay there all night. It wasn't safe. And besides, itself, barns aren't exactly built for people. More for animals and hay, which honestly didn't make for the coziest beds, itself. So after resting a bit and shaking off some of the chill, Tom decided to keep moving. He wrapped his cloak tighter, adjusted his hood itself, and pushed open the barn door. Outside, the snow had thickened, muffling all sounds. The forest loomed nearby, dark and mysterious itself, like a giant waiting for him to step inside. The woods in the Middle Ages were places of both life and legend itself. Villagers told stories about spirits who lived among the trees, ghostly figures that protected the forest or punished those who wandered off the path itself. Some said the spirits could be friendly, others said they were tricksters or worse. Tom had heard those stories too, but tonight itself. He didn't care much about spirits. He cared about shelter. He took a deep breath and stepped into the trees itself. The forest was thick with ancient oaks and pines. Snow clung to the branches itself, making them look like giant frozen spiders stretching their legs. The ground was soft beneath his boots itself, but the cold made each step feel heavy. Tom kept his eyes peeled for any signs of a path itself. Old roads sometimes cut through these woods, narrow, worn tracks that led to villages or forgotten places. But tonight itself, the snow had covered everything, erasing footprints and trails alike. As he walked, he spotted something unusual itself. A crooked wooden cross standing alone between two trees half buried in snow itself. Stone or wooden crosses like this were common in medieval Europe itself. They often marked sacred spots, places where travelers stopped to pray for safety, or where a saint was believed to have passed by itself. Tom approached the cross carefully. It was rough and weathered, the wood cracked by years of wind and cold. He reached out to touch it itself, feeling the cold roughness under his fingers. For a moment, he thought about the stories of forest spirits itself. Maybe the cross was there to keep them away. He whispered, "If there's a spirit around itself, I promise I mean no harm." The wind rustled the branches above, and for a second, Tom thought he saw a flicker of movement itself. But it was just a bird, startled and flapping away. Further on, Tom came across a ruined stone shrine. The roof had collapsed long ago itself, and moss covered the walls like a green blanket. Inside, he could just make out a carved figure, worn smooth by time itself. Shrines like these were once places of worship, where villagers left small offerings, coins, pieces of cloth, itself for food, to ask for protection itself. Tom remembered the village priest telling him once that even the smallest offering could make a difference on a cold night itself. He knelt down and dropped a tiny pebble at the shrine's base. "Keep me safe, please," he murmured itself. The forest grew darker as the sun disappeared completely, swallowed by thick clouds itself. The only light was the pale glow of the snow and a faint, flickering glow in the distance. Tom stopped. There through the trees itself, he saw it, a small light, flickering and warm like a candle or lantern. His heart lifted. Could it be someone? A house! Shelter itself. He hurried toward the glow, pushing through the snow and branches, careful not to slip. The closer he got, the clearer the shape became itself. It was a small hut, almost hidden by snowdrifts and thick branches. Smoke curled from a chimney, twisting up into the grey sky itself. Tom smiled. For the first time since morning, hope bloomed inside him. He moved toward the hut, wondering who might be inside itself. A woodcutter, a hermit, or maybe a kind stranger who would offer a warm fire and a place to rest. As he reached the door itself, he took a deep breath, wiped snow from his face, and prepared to knock. Because in this frozen, dark night itself, sometimes the smallest light is the biggest blessing. Tom's breath was shallow and quick as he made his way through the forest itself, following the faint flicker of light he'd spotted. But just as hope started to warm his heart, the light disappeared behind thick trees itself. The path ahead was swallowed by darkness and snow. He kept going, pushing through the branches and cold like a stubborn little fox itself. Suddenly, through the trees, he saw something big and rough, the skeleton of an old building itself, leaning and creaky against the winter sky. It was a watermill, or at least what was left of one itself. The mill stood beside a narrow stream that was mostly frozen over, the water moving slowly beneath the ice. The wheel was still itself, half buried in snow and broken boards. Tom's first thought, well, itself, that's a fine place to take shelter if I want to spend the night in a frozen ruin. But it was better than nothing itself. Medieval mills were important. They ground grain into flour for the whole village. Usually itself, they were bustling places with the constant grind of stone wheels and the splash of water. But this one had been abandoned for years itself. The roof had caved in on one side, and the wooden beams groaned as the wind pushed through the cracks. Tom stepped carefully across the snow-dusted wooden floor itself. The air inside smelled damp and cold, like forgotten things and frozen dust. The walls were cracked, and bits of plaster crumbled to the ground. A few broken sacks lay in the corner, empty and torn, But the mill's thick stone walls blocked the worst of the wind, and that was enough for now, Tom found a dry spot beneath a fallen beam and sat down, pulling his cloak tighter around himself. His fingers were still numb, but at least he was out of the open air. As he looked around, the eerie silence settled in. The mill was quiet, except for the occasional drip of melting ice and the creak of old wood. It felt like the place was holding its breath, Tom remembered the stories his grandmother told him about places like this: old mills, abandoned churches, and ruined castles were said to be haunted by spirits who didn't want to be disturbed, Some said the miller, who once owned this place, vanished without a trace, and his ghost still wandered the broken hallways, Tom snorted softly. Well, if there's a ghost, I hope he's got a fire. He glanced around nervously but tried to stay calm, Being alone in a cold, dark place was spooky enough without adding ghosts to the mix. Outside, the wind howled through the broken windows, making the shadows dance on the walls. Tom's eyes adjusted to the dim light, and he spotted an old wooden bench near the far wall. He settled on it, leaning against the cold stone. Despite the chill, Tom felt a small spark of safety. The mill might be cold and falling apart, but at least it wasn't the endless, open snow, He thought about the villagers who once worked here. The miller grinding grain for bread, families depending on this place to survive, The thought made him feel less alone. To pass the time, Tom began to explore a little, looking for anything that might help, He found a rusted old lantern hanging by the door, empty, of course, but maybe he could find some dry wood or cloth to make a fire, His eyes caught sight of a pile of old, dry straw in a corner, probably leftover bedding for animals or packing material, He gathered some into his cloak, hoping it might help keep the cold at bay. Then a small noise startled him, a sudden creak from above, Tom froze. Just the wind, he told himself. But his heart raced. He tried to imagine the ghost of the miller maybe shuffling around with an old sack of grain or muttering about lost flour. Maybe he's just hungry. Tom joked quietly, and a little cranky. He smiled to himself. The eerie feeling eased a bit. Outside, the storm raged on, snow piling against the mill's walls. But inside, Tom felt like he'd carved out a little island of shelter in the middle of the frozen wilderness itself. He closed his eyes for a moment and tried to imagine the warmth of a fire, the smell of fresh bread, and the laughter of his family. Even if just for a little while, those thoughts brought him comfort. The night was long ahead, and the cold wasn't going anywhere, But Tom was here, alive, sheltered, and ready to face whatever came next. Tom blinked as the cold seeped deeper into his bones. The abandoned mill wasn't much of a palace, but it was shelter, and in this freezing night, shelter was king. Still, shelter alone wasn't going to keep the chill away. Tom knew one thing: if he wanted to survive, he had to make a fire. A small, steady flame that could push back the cold even just a little. But there was a problem. The mill was old and broken down. There was no neatly stacked pile of firewood, no bundle of dry twigs waiting to be lit. Tom looked around, trying to spot anything he could use. First, he gathered what little dry straw he'd found earlier. It smelled a bit musty, but dry straw was like gold in a frozen world, great for kindling or stuffing into gaps to keep drafts out. Next, Tom searched the corners and shadows of the mill. His eyes adjusted to the gloom, catching the glint of something under a pile of leaves and broken wood. It was a few scraps of old cloth, thick woolen rags, maybe from a discarded cloak or blanket. Score, Tom muttered, feeling a tiny spark of hope. He also found a couple of bits of wood, small branches and broken planks. Most were damp or frozen solid, but some had dry bark. He stacked them carefully near the center of the floor, clearing a small space for a fire. Tom remembered the stories of medieval survival, how important simple tools were. One of the most useful was flint and steel. A sharp piece of flint, when struck against steel, could create sparks, tiny stars that could ignite dry tinder. Tom rummaged through an old leather pouch he had, hoping for just such a tool. Luck was on his side. Inside was a small chunk of flint and a bent piece of steel, probably from his father's tool kit. "All right, old friends," Tom whispered, patting them like trusted companions. He placed a tiny pile of straw on the floor, positioned the flint and steel carefully, and struck. Sparks flew. One landed on the straw, and for a brief moment, a small flame flickered, like a baby bird just learning to fly. Tom held his breath and gently blew on the ember. The flame grew, fragile but alive. Quickly, he added a few tiny twigs and dry bits of wood, feeding the fire. It crackled softly, casting warm, dancing shadows on the cracked walls. Tom smiled, feeling the warmth spread slowly through the mill. Next, he stuffed some of the woolen rags and straw around the broken doorframe, trying to block the cold wind that sneaked in. It wasn't perfect, but it made a difference. As the fire flickered, Tom thought about other medieval survival tools. Oil lamps were popular in villages, small pots filled with animal fat and a wick, burning slowly to light a room. He wished he had one now, but at least the fire gave him enough light to see. Tom wrapped his cloak tighter around himself, tucking the woolen rags beneath. It was like wrapping up in a warm, scratchy hug. Outside, the storm kept howling, but inside the mill, Tom felt a little island of warmth. He knew the fire wouldn't last forever, and the cold would try to sneak back in when the flames died down. But for now, the crackling fire was his shield itself. Tom leaned back against the stone wall, feeling the heat on his face. He thought about how people in the Middle Ages relied on simple things like fire, straw and wool to survive harsh winters. No fancy gadgets, no heaters or insulated boots, just the basics, and maybe a bit of luck. As he watched the flames dance, Tom realized that surviving the cold wasn't just about fighting it. It was about respecting it. The cold was powerful, but so was a warm heart and a clever mind. He closed his eyes for a moment, listening to the fire, the wind, and the quiet night. Tomorrow would be another challenge, but for now, Tom had a fire, a shelter, and hope. And sometimes, that's all you need to get through a freezing night in the Middle Ages. Tom settled down near the small fire he'd built, pulling his cloak tighter around his shoulders. The warmth was a soft hug in the middle of the cold mill, and for the first time in hours, he felt a little less frozen. Outside, the storm was still raging, but inside, the world felt smaller, quieter, almost like a cozy bubble. The firelight flickered, throwing gentle shadows across the rough stone walls and broken wooden beams. Tom closed his eyes for a moment and let the sounds of the night wash over him. The first thing he noticed was the creaking. The old mill was alive in its own way. Every so often, a wooden beam groaned and shifted, making a deep, slow creak that echoed softly through the cold air. It was like the building was breathing, tired but still standing. The wind whispered through the cracks in the walls and the gaps in the roof, weaving a soft, steady song. It rattled loose bits of wood and twirled around the straw on the floor, making little dry sounds like rustling paper. Sometimes, the wind made a low moan, almost like a sad sigh, as if it missed the warmth of summer. Far away, through the trees and the snow, Tom heard a distant howl. It was low and lonely, a wolf calling out to the night. Tom shivered, but not from fear itself. The howl was hauntingly beautiful, part of the wild song of the forest. He imagined the wolf, far off in the dark woods itself, moving silently through snowdrifts, its breath steaming in the cold air. Then came a soft hoot somewhere above him, an owl itself, perched high in the branches outside the mill, adding its voice to the quiet orchestra of the night. The hoot was slow and steady itself, like a question whispered into the darkness. Tom smiled to himself. The sounds weren't scary, they were comforting itself. Like nature's lullaby, even the creaks and groans of the old mill felt friendly, as if the building was keeping watch over him itself. Tom opened his eyes and looked around the dim room. The fire flickered, the shadows danced, and the cold was kept at bay by a small, steady flame. He thought about how, in the Middle Ages, nights were much darker and quieter than today. No bright street lamps or cars itself. Just the stars, the wind, and the creatures of the night. He imagined the villagers back home, tucked into their beds itself, wrapped in thick blankets and woolen cloaks. Maybe their fires were glowing too, chasing off the cold just like his. As he listened itself, Tom felt the tiredness begin to settle in. His fingers thawed a little by the fire's warmth, and his eyelids grew heavy itself. The storm's song was like a gentle rocking, soothing and steady. He let himself relax into the quiet itself. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. The cold, the snow, the struggle to get home. But for now, Tom was safe itself. Surrounded by the soft sounds of the night, warmed by the flickering firelight, and wrapped in his cloak, he drifted towards sleep itself. The wind whispered good night, the owl gave one last hoot, and the old mill stood guard in the frozen dark itself. As Tom settled by the dying fire, the warmth wrapping around him like a soft blanket, his mind started to drift itself. When you're stuck in the cold, with nothing much to do, but listen to the wind and watch the shadows dance itself. Your thoughts have a funny way of turning inward. Tom's eyes grew heavy, but instead of falling asleep itself, his memories began to take shape, bright little scenes from his past, like flickering lanterns in the dark itself. He thought about the village back home, the little stone cottages all huddled close together itself, smoke curling from their chimneys like lazy snakes, the smell of wood smoke and fresh bread baking in the oven, mixing with the sharp itself, clean scent of snow. Tom smiled faintly, remembering the festivals that lit up the long, cold winters itself. How the whole village gathered around the great hearth in the hall itself, where the fire roared so loud it seemed to chase away the winter for a while. Children like Tom would sit on straw mats, wide-eyed itself, listening to old folk tell tales by the firelight. One story always stuck with him, an old legend about winter spirits itself. It went like this: long ago, when the world was young and wild, the first winter came suddenly itself. The animals and plants didn't know what to do itself. The cold was so fierce that even the sun seemed to hide behind a thick blanket of clouds. But there was one spirit, the Lady of the Snow itself, who took pity on the creatures and humans alike itself. She was said to wear a gown of shimmering frost, and carried a lantern that glowed like the moon itself. The Lady of the Snow wandered the frozen lands, lighting the way for lost travelers and guiding them to safe shelter itself. She was gentle but also fierce. If anyone tried to harm the forest or its creatures itself, she would summon biting winds and icy storms to protect her home. Tom imagined her now itself, a shining figure moving silently through the dark woods, her lantern flickering in the night itself. He liked to think that maybe she was still out there, watching over people like him on cold, lonely nights. Sometimes itself, the villagers said, if you listened closely, you could hear her song carried on the wind, a soft tinkling melody like bells in the snow. Tom closed his eyes and tried to hear it. The cold was still pressing in, but in his mind the Lady of the Snow was a warmth all her own itself. He thought too about the stories of heroes People who survived terrible winters by being clever, brave, and a little bit lucky itself. One tale told of a shepherd boy, not much older than Tom, who got lost during a storm. He wandered for days, cold and hungry itself, until he found an old hermit living in a cave. The hermit shared his fire and a bit of bread itself, teaching the boy how to find shelter and start a fire with nothing but flint and dry moss. That boy grew up to be a wise man itself, known in his village for helping others survive the harshest winters. Tom hoped he could be like that one day. For now, though, itself, he was just a boy, sitting in an old cold mill, wrapped in wool and warmed by a small fire. But in his heart itself, the stories gave him courage. The night stretched on, long and deep, but Tom's memories were like little lights, bright and steady itself. He imagined the laughter around the village hearth, the crackle of the fire itself, the voices telling tales that made the cold outside feel less sharp. And as the flames flickered low itself, Tom let those memories carry him gently towards sleep. Because sometimes, when the world outside is frozen and dark itself, the best warmth comes from the stories we carry inside. Tom sat close to the fire itself, watching the flames dance and feeling their warmth chase away the deep chill. Outside itself, the frozen world was quiet, but not quite silent. In the distance, the soft crunch of footsteps in the snow caught his attention itself. His eyes scanned the shadows beyond the broken windows of the mill. Out there, in the cold night itself, the wild creatures of the forest were stirring. Winter was tough on animals just like it was on people itself. Tom remembered the tales of wolves, sleek, clever hunters who moved silently through the snow. They traveled in packs itself, looking for food to survive the harsh months. Some villagers feared wolves, believing they were spirits of the forest itself, or even cursed creatures, but others respected them as part of the natural order itself, knowing that wolves help keep the balance by hunting the weak or sick animals. Tom heard a distant howl, low and mournful, itself carried on the icy wind. It sent a shiver down his spine, but not just from fear. The howl was a wild, itself beautiful sound, a reminder that even in the cold, life went on. Closer by, a flash of movement caught his eye. A fox itself, its bright red fur a striking contrast against the white snow, darted between the trees. Foxes were clever survivors itself. They hunted small animals, scavenged scraps, and used their thick fur to keep warm. Tom smiled, watching the fox pause and sniff the air itself, its sharp eyes alert. Above, an owl hooted softly, gliding silently from branch to branch. Owls were the night watchers itself, their sharp eyes piercing the darkness. Their calls were like gentle reminders that the forest never truly slept itself. Tom remembered that wild boars were also common in these woods. Heavy and strong, they could root through the snow with their snouts itself, searching for roots and nuts. Sometimes, villagers would spot their tracks near the mill itself. Heavy prints pressed deep into the frozen ground. Tom's heart jumped as he heard a sudden rustle near the mill's broken door itself. He froze. Something was close. His hand slowly moved toward the small flint and steel he'd tucked in his cloak itself. The noise grew louder, a soft scraping sound like claws on wood. Tom held his breath, eyes wide in the dim firelight. Was it a wolf itself? A boar? Or something else? The sound paused. Then, just as quickly as it had come, it moved away, crunching through snow and branches itself. Tom let out a shaky breath. The wild creature passed by, uninterested in the cold mill and the small fire burning inside. He smiled itself, feeling a strange mix of relief and respect. The forest creatures were just trying to survive, just like him. In the Middle Ages itself, peasants learned to live alongside these animals. Sometimes they hunted them for food, other times they kept watch for predators itself. Villagers knew when to be wary and when to give animals space. Tom thought about the delicate balance between fear and understanding itself. The creatures of the cold were both a threat and a part of life, reminders of the wild world beyond the village walls itself. As the night deepened, the howls faded, the rustling stopped, and the forest settled once again. Tom felt less alone. The creatures of the cold were out there, living their own stories beneath the frozen sky. And here he was, a small part of that vast, wild world, wrapped in warmth, surrounded by shadows and the quiet music of the night. Tom's stomach gave a low, unhappy growl. Great itself. Just what he needed. Hunger, creeping in like an unwelcome guest, reminding him that the cold wasn't the only enemy tonight. He shifted closer to the fire, hoping the warmth might soothe the gnawing emptiness. But no luck. Hunger had its own way of making itself known. Tom reached into his pouch. Fingers fumbling through the small scraps of food he'd managed to carry. There were a few dried berries, dark, shriveled, and not very tasty. A couple of crumbs from yesterday's bread, hard as stones now, and a small chunk of dried meat, tough but familiar. Not exactly a feast, but something to keep the worst of hunger at bay. Tom chewed slowly, savouring the flavours. In the Middle Ages, food was a precious thing, especially in winter. Back in his village, people knew that when the cold set in, fresh food was scarce. No ripe fruits or fresh vegetables in the frozen fields. That's why they had clever ways to preserve what they could. Dried meats, called jerky today, were a staple. Villagers would hang strips of meat in smokehouses, letting the smoke dry and cure it, so it could last through the cold months. Cheese was another lifesaver. Hard cheeses, aged and firm, could survive weeks or months without spoiling, stored in cool, dark root cellars beneath cottages. Vegetables like carrots, turnips, and onions kept people fed when the fields were buried in snow. Tom thought about how different seasons shaped life. Summer and autumn were times of abundance, fresh fruit, vegetables, and just picked grains. People worked hard to store as much as possible before the cold came. But winter was a test. Scarcity made hunger a constant shadow. Even with a full root cellar, there wasn't always enough. And if a harsh winter hit, food could run dangerously low. Tom swallowed the last bite of dried meat and leaned back against the cold wall. He wondered if the farmers in the village were already feeling the pinch. Maybe his own family had little to eat tonight. Hunger made the cold feel worse, sharper. It gnawed at his energy, making the fire's warmth seem farther away. But hunger also sharpened his senses. He listened to the crackle of the fire, the wind outside, the quiet sounds of the mill. He knew he couldn't just wait. If he was lucky, he'd find food soon. Maybe some roots beneath the snow, or a forgotten stash somewhere. For now he had his small pouch and the memories of village feasts. Even if the bread was stale and the berries dry, it was food. And that was enough. Tom closed his eyes and tried to imagine the warmth of a full meal. A steaming bowl of porridge, thick with honey and spices. Fresh bread straight from the oven. A slice of sharp cheese melting on his tongue. It was a small comfort, but a powerful one. Hunger might be a shadow in the dark, but hope was a light. And sometimes, just sometimes, hope was enough to keep you going through the longest, coldest night. Tom sat close to the small fire, its flickering flames casting warm, golden light around the cold, shadowy mill. The fire's soft glow painted moving pictures on the walls, shadows that danced and stretched, then shrank again. Like restless spirits playing in the dark. His eyes began to grow heavy. It was hard not to feel sleepy when the warmth of the fire wrapped around him like a gentle hug, coaxing his tired body to rest. The crackling of the flames was soft and steady, like a lullaby sung by the night itself. Tom watched the fire flicker, drifting in and out of wakefulness. Each blink seemed to carry him farther from the cold stone floor and closer to a dream. In those moments, the line between the real and the imagined blurred, and the world inside the mill felt a little magical. The dancing shadows on the walls shifted into shapes. Sometimes a tree branch swaying in a breeze, sometimes a friendly face itself, sometimes something strange and otherworldly itself. Tom's mind wandered to the old stories told by the village elders, the tales of angels and spirits who watched over the people itself. Especially in the darkest times, he imagined a soft light appearing in the corner of the room itself, glowing like the morning sun breaking through winter clouds. Out of the shadows stepped a figure, tall, calm, and kind itself. Maybe it was an angel, with gentle eyes full of warmth, or a forest spirit wrapped in leaves and frost itself. The figure didn't speak but smiled, a quiet reassurance that Tom was not alone. Around the spirit itself, faint shapes appeared, ancestors from long ago, wrapped in cloaks of memory and time. They seemed to glow softly itself, their faces kind and wise. Tom felt their presence like a gentle breeze on his cheek itself, a reminder of the long line of people who had lived and survived before him. The fire's warmth grew stronger in his chest itself, spreading like a wave of calm. He closed his eyes, letting the dream carry him. In the dream itself, the spirit reached out and touched the fire, making the flames dance higher and brighter itself. The firelight filled the room with colors, reds, golds, and soft blues. The cold outside seemed to fade away. Tom felt safe itself, wrapped in the embrace of warmth and protection. Then the dream shifted again. He was standing in a forest at twilight itself, the trees towering above him like silent guardians. Snow fell gently, sparkling in the last light of day. The spirit was there too itself, walking beside him, pointing out paths hidden beneath the snow. Tom felt a sense of hope and courage itself, as if the spirit was showing him the way home. Slowly the fire in the mill dimmed, the shadows softening into quiet darkness itself. Tom's breathing deepened, his body relaxing completely. The warmth of the fire and the dreamlike visit blended together itself, carrying him towards sleep. For a moment, he forgot the cold, the hunger, and the long night ahead. Instead, he was wrapped in a gentle light, protected by unseen hands. Watching the fire had become more than just staying warm. It was a doorway to comfort and strength. And as the night wore on itself, with the wind whispering outside and the old mill standing silent guard, Tom finally let go and drifted into peaceful rest itself. The wind howled outside the old mill like a restless ghost, shaking the crumbling walls and rattling the broken windows itself. Tom was half dozing by the fire when a sudden knock echoed through the cold silence. Knock, knock, knock. His heart jumped itself. Who could that be at this time? In the middle of nowhere, on such a freezing night itself. Tom wrapped his cloak tighter around his shoulders and shuffled toward the door, every step crunching on frozen straw itself. He peeked through a crack and saw a figure standing there, hunched against the storm itself, snow swirling like tiny white dancers around their cloak. The visitor lifted a hand, knocking again, softer this time. Tom hesitated. Should he open the door? Stranger danger was a thing, even in the Middle Ages itself. But cold nights had a way of making strangers into friends. He opened the door just a crack, enough to see a face, weathered, kind itself, with eyes bright like embers. "Lost, are you?" Tom asked, voice small but steady. "Eh," the stranger said with a tired smile. "Woodsman I am. The storm caught me off guard." The visitor stepped inside itself, bringing with them a blast of cold air and the smell of pine and earth. Tom closed the door behind them itself, the warmth of the fire wrapping around them both. The woodsman's boots thudded softly on the floor as he sat near the fire itself, rubbing his hands to warm them. Tom offered a small piece of dried meat and some of the berries from his pouch itself. The stranger accepted gratefully. As the fire crackled, they shared stories. The woodsman spoke of the forest, the tall, ancient trees itself, the hidden paths, and the animals he'd seen that day. He told tales of other cold winters, harsher than this one itself, when the village barely had enough food to last. Tom listened, fascinated itself. The woodsman also told about the old laws of hospitality, how in medieval times, offering shelter and food to travelers wasn't just kindness, it was a duty. People believed that helping strangers in the cold brought blessings, protection from misfortune, and sometimes even the favor of saints itself. In fact, many villages had special shelters called hospices, where pilgrims and travelers could find warmth and rest. Tom smiled, thinking how lucky he was to have this unexpected visitor. The woodsman spoke of winter legends itself. 2 stories of mysterious helpers appearing in storms to guide the lost home itself. Much like the Lady of the Snow his grandmother had told him about. Was this visitor real itself? Or just a dream woven by the flickering firelight? Tom didn't care. Right now, the company and warmth were all that mattered. They sat quietly, sharing the fire's glow and the comfort of another human presence. Outside, the storm raged on itself. But inside the old mill, the cold seemed a little less sharp, and in that moment Tom learned that even in the darkest, coldest nights kindness could be a flame strong enough to keep the frost at bay. The fire crackled softly, its flames growing smaller, flickering lower. As the night stretched on, the warmth it gave was fading, and the cold started sneaking back into the old mill creeping along the floorboards and brushing Tom's cheeks like icy fingers. Tom pulled his cloak tighter around himself, wrapping every part of his body he could. The straw beneath him felt hard and cold, but he didn't want to move much. Every little movement seemed to send shivers through his bones. His breath came out in small clouds, floating in the chilly air, like little ghosts dancing before his face. Outside, the wind sighed and whispered, but inside it was quiet, almost too quiet. The last hours before dawn were always the hardest. It was the time when cold felt sharpest, and hope was thinnest. Tom's eyes flicked toward the dying fire. He counted the heartbeats in his chest, slow and steady, like the beat of a drum in an empty hall. 1, 2, 3. Counting helped him feel less alone. It gave his mind something to do besides think about the biting cold. He remembered the prayers his mother had taught him long ago, simple words that comforted people through dark nights. He whispered softly, Domen protege me in hoc noc gelida, so Lord, protect me in this freezing night. The old Latin sounded strange but soothing on his tongue. He said it again, slower this time, feeling the weight of each word like a warm blanket wrapping around his spirit. In medieval times, prayers like these were more than just words. They were shields against fear, bridges to hope, and sometimes, people believed, they carried power to call on saints and angels for help. Tom remembered an old winter chant from his village, sung during long, cold nights to keep spirits strong. Frost may bite and wind may howl, but warmth and light shall not be foul. Hold the fire within your heart, and from the cold you'll never part. He hummed the tune softly, feeling its rhythm steady his breathing. Sometimes he imagined the voices of others singing the same song miles away, in cottages tucked under snowy hills. The thought made the night feel smaller, less lonely. As the fire dwindled to glowing embers, Tom's eyes grew heavy again. He thought about the brave souls before him, peasants, pilgrims, and travelers who had endured countless cold nights without much more than prayers and hope. They wrapped themselves tight in woolen cloaks, counted their heartbeats, and whispered prayers under frozen skies. And now, he was doing the same. Though the cold was fierce, his spirit was fiercer. The night would pass, the dawn would come, and with it, the promise of warmth, light, and a new day. Tom let the quiet darkness hold him gently. He breathed in slowly, counting once more. 1, 2, 3. And then, softly, he drifted toward the first fragile light of morning. Slowly, very slowly, light began to creep into the old mill. At first it was just a faint glow, soft pale, like the shy blush of dawn. Then, It grew brighter, slipping through cracks in the wooden walls and the gaps in the frozen windows. Self. The night was finally giving way to morning. Tom blinked his tired eyes, the cold air sharp against his skin. He sat up. Self. Muscles stiff from the long hours of stillness. Outside, the world had transformed. Self. Snow that looked dull and grey in the dark now glittered like a million tiny stars scattered across the fields. Itself. The frost on the mill's wooden beams caught the sunlight and turned into icicles, sparkling like nature's own chandeliers. Tom let out a small breath, half a sigh, half a smile. He had survived the freezing night. Cold?
Yes.
Hungry? Definitely. But alive? Self. That was what mattered. He stood, stretching limbs that felt as creaky as the old mill itself. His breath puffed out in little clouds. Self. Disappearing into the crisp morning air. He looked around the shelter that had kept him safe, cold, damp. Self. But still a fortress against the biting wind. Tom gathered the last bits of firewood, carefully stacking what was left. Self. Hoping it might be enough to spark a fire again later. He pulled his cloak tighter, wrapping himself in its worn wool like a shield. Self. Outside, the snow crunched under his boots as he stepped out, the sharp cold waking him up better than any breakfast. Self. He glanced around, the frozen stream still silent, the trees standing like silent sentinels dusted in frost. The sun rose higher. Self. Turning the white landscape into a glowing sea of gold and silver. Tom's stomach growled again. He reached into his pouch. Self. Hoping to find something to eat for strength. A few dried berries remained, and a bit of that tough dried meat. Not a feast. Self. But enough to keep him going. He took a deep breath. The long night had been hard, but it was over. Now came the next step, heading home or maybe continuing the journey. Either way. Self. Tom knew he was stronger for having made it through the cold. Itself. He thought about the stories he'd tell when he got back. The night he survived a freezing night in the Middle Ages. Self. With nothing but a crumbling mill, a flickering fire, and a little hope. The morning frost sparkled all around him. Self. A reminder that even after the coldest, darkest night, the sun would rise again, and with it new chances, new stories, itself a new warmth. The cold night was finally behind Tom. Self. But its lessons stayed with him, like the lingering chill in the morning air after frost melts. Self. He walked slowly through the snow-covered fields, feeling the soft crunch under his boots. The world looked fresh, clean, and quiet. Self. As if the cold had washed everything anew. Tom thought about the long night he had survived. Self. It wasn't just about staying warm or finding shelter. It was about respect. Respect for the cold that could bite deeper than any blade. Self. Respect for the night that held dangers both real and imagined. Itself. Respect for the nature that shaped life in ways people couldn't control. Self. The night taught him humility, how small one is against the vastness of the wild and the power of the seasons. Self. But it also showed him strength, how a steady heart, a bit of hope, and some grit could carry you through the toughest times. Self. Tom smiled to himself, thinking about the stories woven into every frozen branch and every crack in the mill's walls. Itself. Those stories were not just about survival, they were about resilience, about how people in the Middle Ages lived simply, but deeply. Self. They faced hardships that could seem harsh to us now, but they met each challenge with courage, community, and sometimes a little humor. Self. He remembered the flickering fire, the whispered prayers, the imagined visits from spirits and strangers. Self. All of it stitched together into a tapestry of endurance. Tom looked up at the pale sky. Clouds were breaking apart. Self. And rays of sunlight spilled down like soft gold. Snow on the trees began to glisten as it slowly started to melt. Itself. Thin trails of smoke curled up from distant chimneys, signs of life, warmth, and homes. The smoke drifted lazily across the sky. Self. A quiet reminder that no matter how cold or dark the night, people kept going. They kept their fires burning. Self. They kept their stories alive. and they kept their hope bright. As Tom took a deep breath, self. The crisp air filled his lungs with new energy. He knew he would carry the night with him, not as a burden, but as a reminder, self. A reminder that even in the coldest moments, there is warmth to be found. Warmth in kindness, in courage, self. In the simple act of holding on. And so, with the melting snow sparkling around him, and the distant smoke rising like a promise, self, Tom stepped forward, ready to face whatever came next, one heartbeat at a time, itself. Because survival isn't just about making it through the night. It's about carrying the light forward.